Welcome to DarshanTalks, powered by the Kulkarni Law Firm.
Hey everyone, welcome to another episode of Darshan Talks. I'm here with the perennial favorite, Micah Berman. Micah is awesome because he comes at it from a public health perspective. We're going to talk a little bit about a new article that he just got published in the New England Journal of Medicine about how the FDA can improve public health by helping people stop smoking. But before I go ahead, Micah, do you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. I'm Micah Berman. I'm a professor at Ohio State in both the College of Health and College of Law, and I work at the intersection of public health and law. And most of my work has been in the area of tobacco policy, and so this is part of that. And I spent a year, now getting to be quite a while ago, working at the FDA Center for Tobacco Products. And so a lot of my interest ties back to what the FDA has been doing.
What I think is interesting, you say quite a while ago, CTP isn't that old. So when you say quite a while ago, you were there at the genesis then.
Yeah, I was. So the law that established CTP was passed in 2009, and I was there from 2011 to 2012. So it was, I think it was about 100 people when I got there, and it was about 250 people when I left. And now it's well over 1,000 people that are in CTP.
Wow. And before we get into your article, what I really want to talk about is what the vision was, because you can speak to what the vision was then, what Congress had contemplated in, say, 2009, what the FDA sort of tried to operate in 2011, and because your article talks about the future. So where are we in 2023? And where will we be going in the future?
Yeah, so I'm first of all, I'll just say that my role there was pretty minimal. I was there as sort of a visiting scholar and visiting advisor for a year, sort of on leave from my academic job. So I was there sort of as a very interested observer, looking around and trying to help put in place the processes for the center. And I think what was obviously the case then, but I think maybe surprisingly has continued to be a problem for the Center for Tobacco Products, is that there is a lot of things that it has to do under the statute, and the things that it has to do have continuously occupied so much of its time and effort that it's been difficult to get to the things that it can do. It's been difficult for it to get to sort of the more proactive agenda of how do we actually think about reducing tobacco use, as opposed to just doing the regulatory pieces that it is actually required to do by the statute. And part of that, and which ties into this article, is when the law was passed in 2009, nobody was thinking about e-cigarettes. That's really not what the law was about, and not what it was intended to be about. And dealing with that issue, or thinking about how to deal with that issue, has consumed a huge amount of CTP's energy. And over the past couple of years, trying to make regulatory decisions about whether or not to grant marketing orders to, they receive literally millions of applications for distinct e-cigarette products. That's why there are so many people there working so hard, is because they've had so many of these applications to review. But because of that, as I said, it's been more challenging for them to get to the proactive agenda, not to mention other political challenges and so forth on top of that. And so one of the things that was on that more proactive agenda that was sort of obvious from day one, and was under discussion when I was there now more than 10 years ago, was prohibiting the sale of menthol cigarettes. And we now, hopefully this year, the FDA has said they will issue a rule doing that and prohibiting the sale of flavored cigars, or at least some flavored cigars, by the end of this year. But we're talking about 2023 when the law was passed in 2009, and that if it's issued would be the first discretionary product standard applied to cigarettes that the FDA has ever issued, even though they've now had this authority for almost 15 years.
There's so much to sort of get into. Let me start with the basic one. Well, actually, let's finish the question we actually started with. The initial question was, where were we? So we answered the question of sort of where we were in 2009. Could we kind of dig into that a little bit more? In that, what was the history of creating CTP? What caused CTP to be created? Let's answer that question first. Move to the next one after.
Sure. So the history goes back to the 90s when the FDA tried to regulate tobacco products under its general drug and device authority, where David Kessler, who was the commissioner at the time, realized, based on sort of whistleblower information that was coming out from within the tobacco companies and documents that were being disclosed as part of lawsuits against the tobacco industry, that the industry for years, despite its denials, have been well aware that nicotine was an addictive drug, and that it was manipulating nicotine levels in cigarettes to produce and sustain addiction. And so Dr. Kessler said, well, if that's the case, then nicotine is a drug, and we as the FDA have the authority to regulate drugs. And so they issued a proposed rule and then a final rule in 1996 regulating cigarettes and smokeless tobacco. And that was immediately challenged in court, went all the way up to the Supreme Court, which in a 5-4 decision in FDA versus Brown and Williamson decided that the FDA did not have that authority because under the court's view, Congress had not. Under the court's view, it was clear that Congress did not want to have the FDA to have that authority. I don't think that was actually clear, but that's what the court said. And because of that, the court said, well, the FDA does not have the authority to regulate tobacco products, but Congress could give it the authority to do so. And then pretty much every year after that, there were bills introduced in Congress to try to give the FDA that authority. And finally, in 2009, it really took, Obama being elected as president and having a president that was willing to get behind and support giving the FDA that authority. A bill was passed in 2009, but the bill was very much a compromise between the tobacco industry and Altria / Philip Morris in particular, and some members of the public health community, and that's what created the political possibility for the bill to actually be passed. But I think, as unsurprisingly, the tobacco industry and the public health groups had very different ideas and visions about what that bill would do and how that would play out. And that's sort of been at the heart of the challenges and the tensions within CTP's role ever since it's been put in place in 2009.
So I'm sorry, I know we're supposed to get to the future, but this is really kind of fascinating to me. So let's start with that period between the Supreme Court saying, Congress, if you really want to give that authority, give that authority, and 2009 when the law was passed. You told me that Congress tried multiple times to get something out there, didn't get very far. Talk to me a little bit about, I don't know if I'm applying sort of hindsight and I get to have the pleasure of doing that, or I lived through the same period you lived through, and I don't remember cigarettes being particularly controversial in terms of being bad for your health in the 2000s. So what was Congress what kind of headwinds were they facing?
They've always faced an incredibly powerful tobacco industry. Less so now than it used to be. I think less so now than even in the 2000s. But even then, there were powerful representatives, and it's been not just one party. It's been powerful representatives from both parties representing tobacco growing states with powerful roles in the Senate in particular, who made it difficult to pass anything that would threaten the tobacco industry's interest. And given how difficult it is to pass something through both houses of Congress generally, they were able to be an effective roadblock. And so it really took the tobacco industry, or at least a piece of the tobacco industry, being willing to sign off on the bill for it to be able to get through. I mean, you're right. There certainly wasn't any dispute about the harms of cigarettes in 2000s, and the tobacco industry was not particularly popular in the 2000s. And actually, we know from their internal documents that accepting FDA regulation was a very deliberate strategy by Altria to try to rebuild its public interest and try to make it look more like a responsible regulated company.
So I'm going to try to sort of distill down these huge decades-long conversations, but what I'm really hearing is it was a dispute between a more libertarian, shall we say, viewpoint of I want to be able to do to my body what I want to choose to do to my body, and or the commercial nature of just how much taxes tobacco brought into those states against the health hazards that tobacco can have an impact on. And that was the battle. Is that a fair summary of the battles between the two political parties?
Yeah, I mean, and again, it wasn't particularly. I mean, there were differences between the two parties, but there were Republicans and Democrats.
Oh, I didn't mean those two, but
both sides of it.
Right.
And so the bill itself that ended up being passed, was co-sponsored by Ted Kennedy, and then Mike DeWine, who is our Ohio senator, and we're having issues with tobacco regulation in Ohio as we speak, so that's interesting. But there were politicians from both sides who supported it, and it was really the tobacco growing states in particular. I mean, if you remember Jesse Helms being in the Senate for quite a long time, and so forth, who were very powerful senators who were able to block anything from moving forward. So when it ultimately passed, it was, I forget what the final vote was, but it was, I think it got north of 90 votes when it was actually passed, but there were a few senators who were able to keep it from moving forward until they essentially got the sign off from Altria to let it go forward.
Talk to me a little bit about Altria. What was this exact deal that has become the crux of tobacco regulation as we understand it today?
Yeah, so I mean, the deal was that the FDA has the authority to regulate tobacco products, but that cigarettes, at least to some degree, so cigarettes are the most deadly, the most popular, the source of the most income for Altria. They're responsible for the vast majority of the nearly 500,000 tobacco related deaths in the US every year, and so the idea was that cigarettes would be more or less grandfathered in, but that they would now be regulated, and they couldn't, the industry couldn't keep sort of changing them and messing with them. And they'd have to report to the FDA, what was in these products. They'd have to, be subject to inspections and all that sort of normal regulatory stuff. But that cigarettes would more or less be able to continue to be sold. And I mean, so that was sort of the tobacco industry's interest, is like now we are a regulated company. We're doing what the FDA tells us to do. And part of that was to then they can make the argument to states and to local governments that we're a regulated entity now, we're more responsible company, the FDA is keeping an eye on us, you don't have to do anything. So whereas, from the public health perspective, there was a lot of discretionary authority built in, that the FDA can issue product standards. So even though it can't prohibit the sale of cigarettes, it can regulate them sort of as a class. So it can prohibit the sale of menthol in cigarettes, for example. It can reduce nicotine levels in cigarettes, for example. So, it has the authority to do these things that would be pretty transformational and have the potential to reduce tobacco use. It, does put, somewhat of a gate around the tobacco industry in terms of the manipulation that they were doing in the past. It has the authority to regulate marketing. It has the authority to regulate sales. And so I think the public health perspective is, all right, we have this, very broad authority. We can start issuing rules that will be pretty transformational. Whereas I think the tobacco industry said, even though the FDA has this authority, we're going to be able to sort of outplay the public health folks on that. And, several of the rules, for example, that I think were the potentially most powerful within the Tobacco Control Act were, more or less immediately struck down in court. So even though the FDA has the authority to regulate marketing, it says in the statute, it can essentially regulate anything up to what is prohibited by the First Amendment. The tobacco industry sort of saw that, well, the First Amendment's a pretty good shield, and we're going to be able to get pretty far in terms of not having our marketing restricted. And so, one of the pieces in the act was that tobacco advertisements had to be black and white text only, with no colors and no graphics, and that was struck down in court almost immediately and has never gone into effect. There's the graphic warning labels that were in the act, to do what most countries around the world have now done, and have large graphic images on cigarette packs. That was written directly into law. That was not even a discretionary thing. That was a mandatory thing that the FDA had to do. But now in 2023, they still haven't done it because every time they try to, the tobacco industry gets it blocked in court with First Amendment arguments. So, I think the industry sort of had an eye on that First Amendment issue, and had an idea that through that and through politics and through other types of legal challenges, it would be able to sort of keep this running for a long time, even in the face of the FDA having pretty broad authority on paper.
So like you said, 2009 watershed moment. We get this conciliatory bill that lets Altria sort of have its cake and eat it too, for lack of a better term, as you see it. And then you come in 2011, and you get to have a first-hand view. Now, I'm not saying you had a decision-making authority or anything like that, but you got to see the difference between hope and execution. Was that chaotic? Because it seemed like there were so many things all happening at the same time from the outside.
Yeah, I mean, I think part of the challenge, I mean, there was some discussion about this actually at the time that the law was passed. And I think there's some discussion going on now about, cannabis in particular. Like there was some discussion about, does it make sense for it to be in the FDA at all, given that it is, tobacco and cigarettes in particular, unlike any other product that the FDA regulates. In fact, that was, part of the reason for the Supreme Court saying that the FDA didn't have the authority is, this is not like a drug. It's a product that just kills people when used as intended. So, there was some discussion about that, but, obviously Congress made the decision to put it within the FDA. And I think that, has consistently been a challenge because the FDA has lots and lots of other priorities. And the FDA is an agency within the Department of Health and Human Services, which at a broader level has lots of other policy priorities. And then, of course, beyond that, the executive branch as a whole has lots of other priorities. So when it's, if it's going to do something aggressive and take on a big political battle, that has to go up through a lot of different chains, which takes a really long time. It gives a lot of time for different political actors to weigh in. And, so one of the issues when I was there, for example, is that the FDA was discussing lots of different things that it could do with respect to tobacco, but the Department of Health and Human Services was also dealing with the rollout of the Affordable Care Act and the legal challenges to the Affordable Care Act. And, these things that were, that was the year of the, NFIB versus Sebelius lawsuit at the Supreme Court. It didn't necessarily want to provoke another legal battle that's going to go up to the Supreme Court. didn't want to provoke another political battle when it's using, so much energy on the Affordable Care Act and so forth. So just, the general political dynamics of thinking through, you have to get the attention of the FDA commissioner who, may have other priorities. You have to get, the attention of the Secretary of Health and Human Services. The last few years, the FDA was occupied with COVID. And so, it's just sort of hard to break through and make this a policy priority. And I think it's been, not just at the FDA level, but I think in general, this, when you tell people that tobacco use kills, 480,000 people a year in the US, I think that's surprising to most people, because most people think of it as an issue that we've sort of dealt with and is not a front burner type of issue. And we just don't treat it. People don't think of it as sort of the public health emergency that I think it is, in the way that it should be treated.
So that was sort of 2011, this which battles do we fight right now? You talked about how the last few years, and you sort of hinted at this, the last few years have been interesting, especially with COVID, but there was also the deeming rule and the like that all happened at that time. We're now in 2023. Where are we now? And let's use that as a jump off point to the article that you actually wrote, or at least helped contribute towards writing. Where are we going?
Right. So what happened was, I think this history is complicated but important, and so I'll try to be quick. But what happened was, pretty soon after the law was passed, we had this issue of, what do we do with e-cigarettes, which were sort of around in 2009, but they were these sort of novelty things that were, sold in malls, which we used to have, and were pretty expensive, and kids weren't really using them because they were really expensive, so that wasn't sort of at the front of mind. The FDA, pretty soon after the law was passed, tried to stop the import of some e-cigarettes, saying that they were unapproved drugs or drug delivery devices because they were delivering nicotine. And that got litigated up to the DC circuit, which ruled that, essentially following the logic, or saying that it was following the logic of Brown and Williamson, that, these sort of nicotine products, unless they were actually making therapeutic claims, should be treated as tobacco products, as long as their nicotine was derived from tobacco, and therefore should be regulated under the framework of the Center for Tobacco Products. And that meant that the FDA had to issue a separate deeming rule if it was going to regulate them. So it's sort of the lawsuit put them in the Center for Tobacco Products court, but then the FDA had to take actually affirmative action to do that. And so, that was, I think that decision was made in 2010. But then the FDA, it didn't have to issue a deeming rule. It said publicly that it was going to, but it took its time to, and it wasn't really until e-cigarettes started to take off in terms of youth use that there was more pressure to do so. And they finally issued a deeming rule in 2016. But then, even then, first of all, you were then at the turnover between administrations. And then it gave a number of years for the law to actually go into effect. So, the FDA didn't really start ramping up its regulation of e-cigarettes until pretty recently. And so you had more or less a decade of e-cigarette sales that were really not subject to regulatory scrutiny, more or less at all. And there were all sorts of problems, and sometimes the FDA sort of jumped in and pushed at some of the more problematic advertising and more problematic products. But for the most part, this industry was entirely unregulated. And now, sort of after the fact, the FDA is issuing what are supposed to be pre-market decisions, but are being issued for products that have been on the market for in many cases a decade, about whether or not they can continue to be sold. And a lot of products it has issued marketing denial orders for, but it hasn't yet really followed that up with any aggressive enforcement. And so in theory, a lot of the products that are being sold now are not authorized and technically shouldn't be sold. But I mean, the FDA is going to have to take some action if it's going to really clear the market of those products.
So I remember around that time, I had certain manufacturers reach out to me at that point and go, well, I don't think the FDA is really going to shut down entire swaths, an entire industry. This is a weird question to ask you, but are they right?
So I think, I getting back to our earlier discussion, like, I don't know how much of this was, how much of the e-cigarette part in particular was part of the tobacco industry's long game. But I do think that part of their long game was being regulated by the FDA makes it harder for new players to jump in. And so, the entities that are actually in position to comply with the pre-market applications, which are not easy and take a lot of effort and a lot of time and a lot of money. The entities that can do that are the bigger players, which in this space are the tobacco companies. I mean, the sort of more successful independent e-cigarette companies have largely now been either bought up or invested in by tobacco companies. So, they are the ones with the capacity to go through these application processes and get their products authorized. And, the smaller independent players, I think it's, they have complained loudly about it. And I think, that it is true to some extent that, it is not easy for them to actually go through that process and get their products approved. And so, you have products, if you look and see which ones have been authorized, it has largely been the ones that have been from the larger companies and the tobacco companies. And I think that is problematic because they have their sort of marketing arms behind them. They have the ability to distribute them much more widely, but that's essentially what you're seeing, which is not, I don't think, an accident, which is not an accident.
The point you're making then, how can the FDA use this to improve the public health as we move forward? Because what you're telling me is that only the larger players can come onto the market. Does being larger mean more responsible? Or, and with all due respect to people who might be listening to this, Juul was a larger player, especially when they were bought over by Altria, but they also showed some of the worst behavior. So I guess my question to you would be, is the idea that we'll be able to improve public health because we have larger organizations that we can enforce against, as opposed to a million smaller organizations who will choose to act illegally because the risk is too low that the FDA is going to go after them?
Yeah, I mean, I think the regulatory theory it would be that you have a more limited number of players that you can sort of watch over closely. Then, in theory, that's a regulatory system that would be easier to implement. But you are absolutely correct that being large is no promise of acting responsibly, and obviously being small is not a promise of acting responsibly either. And getting back to the earlier discussion too, being large, when you are large, you tend to have more political power. Juul has spent a lot of money on investing in its relationships with representatives, and just in the appropriations bill last week in the House, there was a rider introduced to prohibit the FDA from prohibiting the sale of menthol products. So there's still that sort of political piece of it, making things challenging for the FDA. Just to sort of flip over to this article, what we were arguing here for, and I should say I was one of many co-authors on this, and it's a group of people, and I'm sure you're well aware, within the both the tobacco research and tobacco policy worlds, there have been very split opinions about e-cigarettes and the public health promise of e-cigarettes. And so, we sort of started an informal conversation with people who have very different views on that question to try to have some discussion about it and understand each other's perspectives and see where we had shared interests. And the the point of convergence that this article is about is to say that CTP actually is not the only entity that has a role to play here, and CEDAR needs to be playing a more active role as well. Because, if you go back to what I said about e-cigarettes, if a product is making therapeutic claims, then it does become a drug and is regulated under CEDAR. And what we've seen so far is that it's been, really, really difficult for companies to go through that process. And there's sort of no incentive to when you can just say, I'm not making therapeutic claims and I can sell my product anywhere with limited regulation. But now with the FDA stepping in and not granting marketing orders to many of these companies that are out there, companies that have been, implicitly, if not explicitly, saying that their products help people quit smoking, they have the option of going to CEDAR and saying, my product actually helps people quit smoking. I want to get it approved as a smoking cessation therapy. And so what the article is about is essentially CEDAR should be opening its doors and making it substantially easier for companies, and not just e-cigarette companies, but companies that are offering other types of smoking cessation therapies too, to go through that process. And the FDA and CEDAR should be thinking about smoking as a public health emergency, as I mentioned earlier, and should be thinking, this is the leading cause of preventable death. Why aren't we spending more time and effort on thinking about better therapies? Because the ones that are out there are pretty limited in efficacy, and there's a whole lot of room there for innovation. The emphasis on this article was just to try to get a conversation started, and whatever your views are about whether or not e-cigarettes are going to be effective for smoking cessation, we should be open to letting companies put forward the evidence and seeing what happens. If they can make that case and these products are helpful, then that's great, because we need more effective therapies that are going to help people stop smoking. And the other thing to think about is when you go through the CEDAR piece as opposed to the CTP piece, then the tools that CEDAR has are actually, I think, better designed to make sure that the products are getting to the people who need them, and away from kids primarily who don't. And so, I thought sort of from the beginning that it made more sense to regulate e-cigarettes through that pathway as opposed to the CTP pathway. And it's really, really hard when you have sort of a decade of unregulated marketing to then sort of unwind that and start over. I would not recommend that for the regulation of anything. So it's hard to get people to sort of rethink it. But, I think if you were thinking about it from the beginning, it makes sense that if you are thinking of your product as something that's going to help people quit smoking, then you go through the pathway that is intended for smoking cessation therapies, and you go through that process. And what we've said is we think that the FDA should make that process easier. It should make it easier for people to get investigational new drug applications through so that they can start the process. It should be potentially even thinking about incentives to make it easier, and give companies some runway to get promising therapies going. So that piece of it. So it's just that we haven't had substantial innovation in smoking cessation in a very long time. E-cigarettes may be one way to get there, but there are other I think potential options out there as well, but FDA can be doing more to open its doors and treat this like more of the public health priority that it should.
I'm going to add two components. I rarely do this, but I thought it's fascinating, and we can end it at that point. But the one thing that really spoke to me is a comment you made a second ago, which was you wouldn't wish on anyone the idea of taking an unregulated product and then trying to regulate it. But to me, it reminds me of exactly what the FDA and most regulatory agencies do, in that I'm thinking of like stem cell research. I'm thinking of marijuana. I'm thinking of any of those. The idea being, I don't know how you as an industry want to play this first. It makes no sense to regulate something until I understand how you intend to operate. So to me, while I understand your thought process 100%, to me, this is very administrative agency. I want to see how this works before I go regulate it. Would you disagree with that comment?
Yeah, no, I think there's a balance there.
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, I think that makes sense, but at the same time, like the window here
went too far
long, and I think you have a lot of companies in the e-cigarette space thinking, this product is going to be regulated, so let's try to make as much money as we can in as little time as we can, and that just creates really, really bad incentives.
Talked about going down the CEDAR route, and for those people who are kind of new to this, CEDAR being a center for drugs, but the question I have though is, we have things like patches, and we have things like the I think it's the smoking, I forget what it's called, you put in your mouth, and then you've got the gums and the like. So we have those pathways. Companies have just chosen not to use it, primarily I would imagine because it's really, really expensive. You go through that process. Yes, you get to make the claim of smoking cessation, but the end result of it is you have a very expensive process that takes too long, that comes to the market. Then you have a lot of excessive regulation. The upside is very, very limited compared to the downside. And I don't see FDA changing that for a particular class of products. So what are you guys proposing as incentives to make that happen?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, you do have the incentive sort of happening naturally if CTP sort of closes the door on these products and they want to keep selling them. But yeah, I mean, I think I would agree with almost everything you just said. Here, I think what's different here is you are talking about a product where the alternative is cigarettes that are essentially the most deadly commodity ever created. And so I think what we were advocating here is, that should be a factor in the consideration here of, both in terms of sort of the timeline and also in terms of, the safety profile, for example, that you're looking for. It might have to be a little different here than it is for other products, because you're talking about, if it's a product that is going to get people to switch and to quit smoking, even if the risks are, slightly higher than you might think about in other contexts, I don't necessarily want to put a marker on what exactly I think that would look like, but I think it's at least something that the FDA has to think carefully about, given the absolutely massive harms on the other side of it. And you're talking about I forget what our number is, but 30 something million smokers a year, the vast majority of whom try to quit in any given year. So your potential market is massive. So if you can get through the process, I mean, the gums and lozenges, in their basic form were approved in the 80s and haven't changed all that dramatically since then. And, a lot of people have tried them and found that they don't work, and are looking to try something else. And so if you can get through that, your potential payoff on the other side is pretty significant. So, if you don't have a, unregulated market on the other side, that is, a more favorable option. I think, this pathway actually does make sense for people. If the FDA also thinks about, how do we be a think about how to be a partner here, and try to make this so it works in a commercially reasonable timeline. And part of it is especially for products that have been on the market, taking the evidence that they have gathered from real world use, as opposed to starting over with clinical trials, which I think clinical trials have problems in the smoking cessation context, which is a whole different conversation. There might be other ways to think about what is the evidence that we actually need to at least get this process started.
Awesome, Micah. Thank you so much for doing this. I'm excited to have you on the next time around.